The lush green hillsides of Central America. This is the Republic of Honduras, often called the archetypal Banana Republic. At first glimpse, barely distinguishable from Nicaragua, El Salvador, or Guatemala, all names that we have become more familiar with in the last few years. And all Central American countries that have much in common besides environmental characteristics. The capital of Honduras, Tegucigalpa, sprawls in the valley, a mixture of a Spanish colonial past and modern concrete. The people of the whole region are a mix of Spanish and Indian blood, but the Hondurans have retained more of their Indian heritage. They worship in the Roman Catholic Church, but hold on to old Indian customs too. Now American influence has been added, as Central America attains a new importance in world politics. Honduras lies in the middle of the region, and it shares borders with three troubled neighbors: Guatemala to the west, El Salvador to the southwest, and Nicaragua to the southeast. It is these borders which have brought it into the news and encouraged the interest of the United States. The United States Embassy in Tegucigalpa, as inaccessible as every American diplomatic headquarters in Central America. This headquarters has taken on a new importance at a time when Washington is expressing increasing concern about the spread of left-wing radical influence in Central America. President Reagan has referred to Honduras as an oasis of peace in the region, and so foreign aid has been generous. According to the Washington-based Institute for Policy Studies, there have been as many as 8 groups of American military advisors in Honduras at various times through 1981. The United States started to become interested in the country during the Carter administration. It is alleged that during the Carter years, Honduras was chosen as a strategic staging ground for possible American military operations in the region, if the combined Cuban and Soviet influence in the area looked set to threaten the United States. But along with military advice, the U.S. Embassy in Honduras has been insistent that elections, promised for a decade, should and would take place. And they did, at the end of November. They had been encouraged and publicized enthusiastically by the American State Department. Some say with hopes that Honduras would be an example of enlightened U.S. policy towards Central America, especially at a time when the United States government was being criticized for failing to help find a solution to the awesome violence racking El Salvador. The people of Honduras have been ruled mostly by the military since independence. November's general election was only the second since 1932. In 1971, a proposed election was so tainted with fraud that less than half the electorate bothered to vote. This time, the people were convinced that Provisional President Policarpo Paz Garcia, who has held power for 3 years, would hand over to the civilian president they chose. The contest was primarily between the very conservative Nationalist Party and the right-of-center Liberal Party. But even before the outcome was known, the leaders of both parties had to agree certain concessions to the military. The Superior Council of the Armed Forces now has a veto over all cabinet appointments. And there is to be no investigation of corruption in the present government of the armed forces. These are conditions that Nationalist Party leader Ricardo Zúñiga Agustinus would grant easily. He has always supported the army and believes Honduras is facing life and death problems. Always close to the power elite, Zúñiga insists that the answers to Honduras's problems don't really depend on social reforms. He says that the real threat that hangs over all of Central America is the communist conspiracy. But he also said in this interview that under his leadership, Honduras would follow its current policy of non-interference in the internal affairs of its neighbors. He added that he expected other Central American countries to follow the same policy. Zúñiga went on to say that he felt his country's relations with the United States could be summed up in one word: magnifico. He felt that the Americans were playing a major role in the economic recovery of the whole region. He also felt there was no problem of interference by the United States in the internal affairs of the region.
Ha habido crítica que los Estados Unidos han ayudado mucho a los militares acá.
But Zúñiga's campaign, and those of his opponents, was not always so straightforward. There were charges and countercharges of corruption, and Zúñiga's daughter alleged that a win in the election would be stolen from her father through fraud. November 29, 1981. Though there were doubts right up until the last minute, the polls opened and were swamped by the Honduras electorate. Almost 90% of eligible voters cast a ballot. 500,000 people voted for Zúñiga's Nationalist Party, but an overwhelming 650,000 voted for the Liberal Party. It was a vote for a return to complete constitutional rule and promised social and economic reforms. Corruption and the economy were key issues in the Liberal campaign. But just how the new government will tackle the problems of chronic underdevelopment in Honduras is still unclear. Austerity measures might be unpopular. Anti-corruption measures are sure to enrage the military. And enforcement of land reform laws could alienate the big landowners. President-elect Dr. Roberto Suárez Cordova will take over in January. He inherits foreign reserves that have sunk to $13 million and a tattered credit rating. If he serves his first four-year term, he will be the first Honduran president to do so since 1928. Assassinations or coups have ended official terms of the rest. The new administration will also have to deal with a growing group of leftists who think that revolution is the only way to change Honduras. Two guerrilla groups were apparently set up last year after the Sandinistas' triumph in Nicaragua. The government says they work closely with the revolutionaries in El Salvador, and they say the several large shipments of arms allegedly traveling through Honduras for the Salvadorian guerrillas were intercepted by the Honduran army. These are the kind of slogans that were daubed on the walls in Nicaragua before Somoza was thrown out. And they are the same kind of messages that can be found in both Guatemala and El Salvador today. But the people of Honduras do have one distinction from their poor neighbors in Central America. They are even poorer. This is the way most people in the country live, always on the breadline, in shanties on the hillsides where they draw water from communal taps. Fewer than half the people in the country have access to clean water. The government has come up with self-help schemes to try and improve the conditions of the people. But they are up against a strong right-wing feeling that socialism is bound to creep in if too much is done for too many people.
¿Y ustedes están más satisfechos viviendo aquí?
Sí, porque
This woman is living in a housing colony built by a workers' association. She says she is very happy with her new accommodation. She pays a small rent to the government for the land, but she owns her house. She is one of a few lucky Honduran peasants.
sí está ayudando porque nos da una cuota baja, ¿verdad? Para que podamos pagarla. En esa forma nos está ayudando de que tenemos que pagar una cuota poca.
Of the 3.5 million people who live in Honduras, more than a third live in cities and towns. 3/4 of all the land is owned by only 10% of the people. That means 1 million people who live on the land don't own it. The fertile land of Honduras should have little trouble in providing for the population. But in any world recession, poor agricultural countries are often worst hit. Honduras has had little choice in the last few years but to continue to produce cheap food for export. The result is that people who live in poverty get poorer. Infant mortality in Honduras is high, and most children are malnourished. A social framework does exist for education and medicine, but fewer than half of Honduran adults can read or write, and there are less than 5,000 hospital beds available to the entire population. The new Córdoba government has little to build on and has been hit hard by high interest rates, rising oil prices, and depressed earnings from cash crop exports. But the real story of Honduras is tied up in bananas. 20 million 40-pound boxes of bananas leave Honduras every year. The banana industry determines the lifestyle of most of the people. Large companies were first attracted to Honduras for two reasons: the proximity to United States ports and, more important, the extremely low labor costs. There are two major companies that operate out of Honduras. One is the Standard Fruit Company, which has its headquarters in the port city of La Ceiba. 30 years ago, the peasants who worked for the company and United Brands actually won a long and bitter struggle to organize themselves into trade unions. But the vast banana plantations are still mostly controlled by outside interests. Despite the fact that the Honduran workers have one of the strongest trade union movements in Central America, reforms have been few and far between. Years of military rule have meant a 20-year promise for agrarian reform has still not been realized. In the early 70s, the major banana companies had already decided that labor unrest and the stirrings of nationalism in Central America made banana growing an unprofitable exercise. Then, in 1974, Hurricane Fifi struck. 50% of the food crop was washed away by the heavy rains that followed the hurricane. It was the worst disaster in Honduran history, with thousands of people killed. But the effect it had on the economy was crippling. 3/4 of the banana crop was wiped out. Rather than rehabilitate their plantations at Isletas, Standard Fruit sold the ruined lands to the Honduran government. Isletas became a workers' cooperative, where wages tripled from $1 a day to $3. Schools and clinics were set up, and production levels returned to pre-hurricane levels by 1977. But the private companies have maintained their monopoly on shipping and marketing. Unrest on the plantations has continued, and early 1981 was marked by a strike at the Isletas co-op. But poor peasants have no funds, and long strikes could mean starvation for many families. So bananas continue to leave Honduras by the ton, and many Honduran families remain, as their parents and grandparents were, enslaved to the banana. The land that is not growing bananas provides another product for the North American market. Lush pastures throughout Honduras are grazing ground for prime beef for export. According to a doctor interviewed in Honduras, most Hondurans eat meat about once a month and are deprived of protein a lot of the time. The staple diet for most people is beans, and even beans have had to be imported in the last few years. The Honduran economy is also tied to the world price for sugar and cotton, and there is no such thing as an OPEC to make sure the price to the growers keeps in line with world inflation. Coffee is also grown for export, but though annual growth is supposed to be good right up to 1983, Coffee prices are not set with the producers in mind. And prices haven't been good. "45% of Honduras is covered with forest, so timber has become one of the 4 main industries in the country. The major client is again the United States, and recently the Americans have sponsored a $600 million project to build 3 sawmills and a pulp and paper plant. But the crucial question for the Honduran economy is the control of transport and marketing. The peasants go on producing for a foreign market that for the most part determines what it wants to pay, and more important, maintains its hold on shipping inside and outside the country. Critics of the Honduran elite say that there are profitable links between the military, the American corporations, and large landowners, which make it impossible for the majority of Hondurans to pull themselves out of poverty. As in every other Central American country, there have always been a few families who benefit from the enormous riches of the area. The city of La Ceiba and these pleasing middle-class houses attest to the affluence of a few Hondurans. But allegations as to how the elite come by its comforts are rife. Some reports have alleged that most prices in transactions are upped 50% due to payoffs. And while the rest of the economy moves from crisis to crisis, the black economy is said to be thriving. But with relative stability at home, the new civilian Honduran government will be concerned with its neighbors' problems, and worrying that a pattern might be developing. The Sandinistas in Nicaragua succeeded in ousting the corrupt administration of Anastasio Somoza in 1979. Since then, the Nicaraguan-Honduras border has been a source of sensitivity to both sides. Nicaragua claims that thousands of men who are loyal to the Somozistas are preparing to invade Nicaragua from Honduras. And they also allege that the Honduras government has given its blessing to the raids. The Honduras military is said to be split as to how they should deal with their next-door neighbors. The Sandinistas celebrate their revolution. But skirmishes on the border of Honduras have taken a toll. The Sandinistas know that there are some military commanders in Honduras who are pledged to crush what they see as the communist menace next door. These people are calling for the United States to request Costa Rica and Honduras to close their borders with Nicaragua and implement an economic blockade. But the people of Honduras have chosen a new leader who takes a more moderate view of the Nicaraguan revolution. President-elect Córdoba says he would never support a military blitz of Nicaragua. And Foreign Minister César Elvira Sierra assured Nicaraguans in early December that the policy of his country was, quote, eminently defensive. But it is this border, the one with El Salvador, that is causing most concern with the Hondurans, and with the Americans who have put their confidence in the Duarte government in power in San Salvador. This area of Central America is patrolled both by Salvadorian security forces and their Honduran counterparts. They are both looking for left-wing guerrillas that they believe use the growing refugee camps as hideouts. The Salvadorian army complains that their war against what they call the subversivos has no front. And to prove the point, 1,000 Salvadorian troops crossed into Honduras recently to hunt for guerrillas in teeming camps like this one, La Virtud. Salvadorian refugees, terrified by the carnage of civil war at home, head to the Honduran border for some kind of peace. But so far, the war has found its way across the border too. And many of the refugees insist it is with the help of Honduran officials. In late November, evidence against the Honduran military and Honduran right-wing organizations was mounting. One Salvadorian refugee at La Virtud camp spoke for many when she disagreed with the governments of Honduras, El Salvador, and the United States, all of whom said the camp should be moved deeper into Honduras.
Reubicación, señora.
The woman insisted that there was no point in relocation. She said the security forces of El Salvador would find them anywhere. All the refugees wanted, she said, was to go home, to live and die in El Salvador.
Entonces nosotros lo que deseamos es regresar a El Salvador porque allá es nuestra tierra y allá queremos vivir y morir allá también.
But all these refugees act as a constant reminder to the Honduran government and military of what could happen at home. The tenuous peace could be broken if the poor in Honduras decided that they too wanted a reordering of society, that they wanted what Nicaragua is today trying to attain, and what the guerrillas of El Salvador promise. Until a few years ago, the plight of poor Central American peasants like these would not have gained much attention. And it is only in the light of a new Western foreign policy that the plight of the refugees receives attention today. The concern is that the influence of the Soviet Union, as it now exists in Cuba, might take over the whole region. The Reagan administration has made the political fate of Central America one of its main foreign policy planks. It's invested in the security forces of El Salvador, and it is now increasing its investment in Honduras. In November, an American congressional committee, which included Bianca Jagger, former wife of the British rock star, went to La Virtud camp to report on the operations of the various relief organizations there. Their observations only added to the fears that Honduras was not a safe haven for people fleeing the civil war in El Salvador. In fact, they witnessed themselves the freedom with which the Salvadorian troops moved across the border and took away people they alleged were left-wing guerrillas. Congressional aide Robert Brower.
The tragedy of some significant proportions was barely averted here yesterday by the really gallant behavior of the many organizations and the few international people who happened to be here. It could well have ended up in the immediate murder of several score and the possible annihilation of the camp. It was a failure of will of the Honduran army to protect Honduran soil and their refusal to protect the refugees in the camp. It raises serious questions about the United Nations refugee agency as an international bureaucracy to function without the assistance of the Honduran government, and it causes me as a congressional aide to raise serious questions about how effectively our money is being spent.
Bianca Jagger also feared for the safety of the refugees.
These refugees feel their life are in danger every minute since I have arrived. I feel as well that not only the refugees' lives are in danger, but as well the international organizations that are working with the refugees. Many people who have been working with international organizations who happen to be Hondurans have been put in jail and tortured. I feel that there is not only the danger against these refugees when they are in this area, but there is the danger of the refugees when they be moved to a new area. Because the incursion of the Salvadoran army is not been only by land, but as well by air, as it happened in July 1981, that was recorded by El Tiempo. I feel that it is very important to say that if they take away all the international observers that are here working with international organizations, that this area will be left unchecked, and the future refugees, who will be the civilian population who will try to cross the borders, will be stopped and greater atrocities might take place in El Salvador, where people won't be able to escape coming to Honduras. I think that it is very important that people be aware that the people of the United States and the people of their allies, the European countries as well, know what's going on here, and the representative of the UN will come and investigate what's taking place against human, innocent people, against women, children and older people, against international organizations who are dedicating their life to protect the refugees, and against the few international persons who come here to investigate what's going on. I think that it will be very important that a delegation from the Congress and a delegation from the Senate comes and investigate what's going on today with the refugees.
Musicians in the square of the Honduran capital, a long way from some very tense borders. So far, Honduras has managed to avoid much of the civil strife that has tormented Nicaragua, El Salvador, and Guatemala. One leading businessman says this is because the disparities in Honduran society aren't as great as they are in neighboring countries. The new year will bring a new civilian government to Honduras. But will this Central American country be able to maintain its relative tranquility in the midst of a region torn by political and social strife? Or will the people of the country called the archetypal Banana Republic decide that they too want change?